Our speaker this evening is Rosalie Manning, and she's the chairperson of the Safe and Inclusive Church Commission and Provincial Deputy Registrar for the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. And she's going to speak to us on the subject of the Safe and Inclusive Church Commission in the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Rosalie. I was just saying before the event started that one of the wonderful effects of being able to meet on Zoom is that we can gather together in a way that just wouldn't logistically be possible. And as many of us, no doubt at this meeting, will be Anglicans from different parts of the world, we're able to meet and learn from one another and share things. And that is a wonderful thing that technologies like Zoom offer. So Rosalie, it's really good indeed to welcome you virtually to this ELS event. And we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say, and then a little later on to having a bit of discussion and questions. So over to you, Rosalie.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Russell and Norman for having invited me to share with you in this way. It is really good to be here. I was just sharing that it's a very hot day in South Africa today. I believe you're all excited because it's spring in the Northern Hemisphere, while we're still roasting in the Southern Hemisphere. So Russell had asked me to specifically talk to you about our journey to the Safe and Inclusive Church, but to start off by telling you a little bit about the province of Southern Africa. So you'll be pleased to know that we are a member of the Communion. We've been an independent province for 153 years this year. We have Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, who's currently our metropolitan, and his predecessors was Winston Undungani, and prior to that is the Archbishop you're probably all more familiar with, which would be Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We're not the Anglican Church of South Africa, we're the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. And the reason for that is up until September last year, we actually included 9 countries. So in September last year, the countries of Mozambique and Angola was separated and went into their own province. So that's the newest province in the Communion, Iama, the Anglican Church of Mozambique and Angola. And currently, the Anglican Church of Southern Africa is South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, Namibia, and the islands of Tristan da Cunha and St. Helena. That all forms part of the province. Obviously, St. Helena and Tristan da Cunha are still British protectorates, but for purposes of the Anglican Communion, they're also part of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. In this particular geographic region, South Africa is the sort of largest part of that province. And a lot of the legislation and a lot of the thinking that goes into the way we govern the church is predicated on what happens in South Africa. For instance, Lesotho has a prime minister, so they still run by a king. But their monarchy is not as absolute as the monarchy in Swaziland. Some of you would have seen some of the social unrest that we've had in Swaziland. It's now called Eswatini, as a result of the absolute monarchy that exists there. So the constitutional protection for people's rights within those countries are not as developed or as advanced as South Africa's. And that does give us some interesting expressions of faith within our particular province. Having said that, as sort of background, South Africa up until 1992 was a Christian state. The apartheid government were very adamant about them being a Christian state. And the fact that they were so strongly Christian is what made it possible for the church to assume the position it did in terms of challenging the evil that apartheid was. And when we got our freedom in 1994, we in fact then moved from a Christian state to a secular state. And we then have one of the most advanced constitutions in the world, in South Africa, with a very strong Bill of Rights that has developed along the lines of what most countries look up to and admire. But the challenge, as we all know, with any bit of legislation is how we actually go about implementing it. So in both the former dispensation as well as under our constitutional democracy, the church's canon law is recognized as a separate legal system. And as long as the church follows its own laws, and our laws don't conflict with the provisions of the Constitution, and secondly, observe the standards or requirements of natural justice, the secular courts are very reluctant to interfere. There's a lot of jurisprudence and a lot of case law in support of this particular position. And so ACSA is able to conduct its fairs largely according to its own rules. We are, for tax purposes, registered as a public benefit organization for religious purposes. No, we don't give tax deduction certificates for tithes. That's not what we do, but there are other donations that will be tax exempt. So that's the sort of governance framework for the Anglican Church and the way the state views us. I think for all of us, we started, along with most members in the communion, to have the conversations around sexuality within ACSA. And this was predicated largely along the fact that our Bill of Rights and our legal framework actually recognizes same-sex marriage as a legal institution in South Africa. And the challenge then became, so what happens about to the church and the church's particular doctrine and position, given what the secular courts were required? To date, we've not had any challenge of our non-blessing or non-allowance, our not allowing same-sex marriages in the church, but we think it's probably just a matter of time. However, in order to preempt this, and there's a long conversation around how under the Bill of Rights with the Freedom of Religion clause, you're still able to maintain your doctrine to the extent you do for good religious reasons, and that's why it may be unlikely that the courts will in fact force us into recognizing or performing same-sex unions. But that's the legal situation as we currently have it. We don't know what will happen if it gets challenged or if it gets changed, but that's where we are at this moment. So with that in mind, and given the strong activism that was around the recognition of human rights within the country, the church then went on this journey of trying to understand the hearts and minds of the people around the issue of same-sex unions. And we then, under the Archbishop's auspices, established the Archbishop's Commission on Human Sexuality. And so we started to look at all forms of human sexuality in this particular commission, not just that of homosexuality. And I was fortunate enough to serve on that commission. And I must say, it was a learning experience. I was quite astounded by what I found and uncovered, and realized just how far we have to go on understanding the different nuances and expression of sexuality that exists, and how we need to manage it around our particular values and cultures. So in South Africa, most of you may be aware, we have a number of different tribal groupings, for want of a better word, but they're different cultural practices. And some of them actually recognize polygamy as well as child marriages. Now, in terms of the secular law, polygamy is recognized. It's a legal state that's accepted, but child marriage is still prohibited, although there are cultures and communities that do practice forms of child marriage. There are also different cultural practices around how, when somebody believes that they have been hurt or affronted by a member in this community, how the community actually deals with it. So the question then of same-sex marriages on our particular journey we went around to different parts of the province, and so we traveled quite extensively, and went to have open forums in different communities to get stories, experiences from ordinary people, and just to give them a space to be heard. And it is out of that experience that the need was identified for issues of dealing with safety and abuse, specifically given some of the stories we heard on that particular journey. Now, all of us who've seen Spotlight or any of the movies around sexual abuse in the church will understand some of the challenges that that presents for us. But in South Africa, we also had the further complication, for want of a better word, around the question of HIV and AIDS. And there was some community and some traditional leaders who in fact advocated having unprotected sex with virgins as a cure for AIDS. And that was found expression in our church as well. So that was also a dimension that we needed to come to terms with. And so when we set out on this journey of safety and inclusion, there were a number of nuances and expressions that were not necessarily known to us that we needed to account for within our particular approach. In the paper that I wrote for the Anglican Law Journal, I actually did set out the different expressions of human sexuality that we encountered, as well as the need then for the intersection between that and safeguarding, which started to become a particular feature within the Anglican communion. Our Safe Church journey then took the form of following the charter that was developed by the communion. We then customized it for our own purposes. And because we were so adamant about looking at the issue of human sexuality in safeguarding, we are the only commission in the province that is called the Safe and Inclusive Church and is not just about safeguarding. And the work for us has been built around the pillars that are in the charter. And so we deal with complaints, we deal with pastoral care, we find expressions for finding support for both what we call victims. We don't call victims and respondents or accused. We talk about complainants and respondents, and we leave it up to the victim, well, the complainant, to identify for themselves whether they are a victim of abuse or a survivor of abuse. But we use the word complainant so that the person who's complaining has agency over their story and can for themselves determine whether they sit in the box of being a victim or whether they sit in the box of being a survivor. The other principle that we have accepted is that given the fact that we are such a hierarchical church, often we're aware of the fact that cases of abuse get stifled and shut down at the local level where they're first raised. And so to circumvent that, our Safe Church, any person can report a matter to Safe Church directly. And that then bypasses any opportunity at the local level for it to be shut down or concealed. So it can come straight directly to the provincial Safe Church team. We are completely independent. It works because we're hierarchical, and I'm the Deputy Provincial Registrar. So in terms of our hierarchy, bishops, everybody else would then be sort of subordinate to the process because it's a provincial structure. We have certain principles we've adopted for Safe Church. So we will investigate every complaint we receive. That's quite a challenge, given the fact that we're presently still volunteers mostly. We will investigate every complaint without fear or favor. We start off from the point of view that we will believe the person who complains. We provide pastoral care, and then we do a whole range of investigations to actually try to discern what the truth is in that particular story. That will then determine whether the process goes through any of our canonical processes or whether it could be subject to what we used to talk about as restorative justice, but that we're now starting to look at transformative justice, given the context in which we live. So the restorative justice seeks to restore that which is broken. But the transformative justice process actually starts to look at the systems that cause the event to take place. So if the simple example is to try and distinguish what's the difference between transformative and restorative justice. In restorative justice, if I stole your bag, for it to be fixed up, I was hungry, I stole your bag. So to be restored, you'd get your bag back, but I would still be hungry. On transformative justice, what we then look at is the system that gave rise to my hunger, which caused me to steal the bag. And that's then the work that we actually need to grapple with. And that's what we feel as a commission we are most strongly called to, because the question of what does a safe and inclusive church look like is kind of our North Star. And the second question is, what are the systems that make abuse possible in the church? So what is the structure? What is the systems? What is the processes that make abuse possible? We deal with 13 categories of abuse, and I'm sad to say that most of the complaints relate to sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. There's a lot of relationship hardship that also comes through, and that gives rise to a huge breakdown amongst people. We have on occasion been used as a place for people to get even with each other, where the relationship has gone horribly wrong. And it does make us ask questions about, given that as a church we have marriage as sacrament, are we doing enough teaching around this particular sacrament? Because, for instance, in Southern Africa, and in South Africa in particular, 2 out of every 3 marriages end in divorce. Now, that is quite an alarming statistic, and it is no different in the church. Our estimate in terms of our numbers within the Anglican Church of Southern Africa is we think we're about 5 million Anglicans, but we are about to embark on a census, and we'll then have a better sense of what it looks like. We have very strongly developed pastoral standards, which are the guidelines that set out how we all ought to behave as ministers. And when we talk about ministers in ACSA, we speak about both lay and ordained ministers. And for lay people, we talk about any person who's in leadership in the church. Anybody, whether it's a guild, whether you're the server, altar servers, leader, that we consider you a minister in the church, and therefore you are subjected to the same standards of behavior as whether you're ordained or not. There are different canonical processes to deal with discipline for lay and ordained people, but primarily because we are a voluntary organization, the country's rules allow for us to be able to deal with matters, disciplinary matters internally. Of course, where the abuse includes a criminal act, we will, as Safe Church, journey with the complainant to get the matter into the criminal justice process. I'm sure most of you are aware that our criminal justice system is particularly broken, especially when it comes to sexual offenses. Our conviction rate is really low. Our number of cases reported is very high. We have an alarmingly high rate of femicide and murder by intimate partners. So our gender-based violence statistics are shocking. But it's work that I believe that as church, we have a responsibility to pursue and to start engaging with, hard as it is, but that the members of the commission are committed and dedicated to making sure that we actually have some safety and inclusion. Russell, have I done justice to what you've asked me to tell everyone?
Well, that's really, really fascinating, Rosalie. It really is. Thank you so much for those words, really setting the scene. And I hope we'll have a good amount of time now to continue with a bit more discussion and questions, because you've raised so many interesting things which are very relevant, I'm sure, in every church in the Anglican Communion. I know that as well as some people in the meeting from ACSA, there are others like me from the Church of England, and there may be others as well. Well, gosh, there's 2 questions I want perhaps to kick off with, and then open it up. So see how that goes. So what I'll just say is, anyone else, if there's anything you want to contribute to the discussion, then either for the moment type it into the chat, or find the raise hand button, which I was just saying how they're always moving things around on Zoom. It's under reactions now on my Zoom, and then if you raise hand, I'll know you want to say something, or write it in the chat. So have a think about that, because I do hope we'll have some good discussion. So there were two things in particular, Rosalie, from what you said, and thanks so much for setting in context, which I think is so important, isn't it? The context of the commission and of ACSA's particular context, and our context in the Church of England is that both the areas you've particularly mentioned, sexuality and safeguarding, are things that are and have been for years very much at the centre of a lot of the attention of the church at a national level. So for the first point I wanted to ask is, you mentioned that it's quite a unique approach in ACSA to have the Safe and Inclusive Church Commission. And from what you've said, that mention of inclusive is particularly focused on sexuality. So in the Church of England, there are a number of very significant streams of work to address matters of safeguarding and redress, but as far as I'm aware, that's pretty separate organisationally in terms of the structures from the recent discussions that have been happening, Living in Love and Faith, about sexuality, and the groups and discussions around that. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or observations on what the strengths or maybe the weaknesses are of holding the two together in one commission, safe and inclusive, and how that's meant that ACSA has perhaps approached things differently than in churches as in England, where they've been relatively separate.
Thanks for that question, Russell. It has its own tensions. It is not a naturally easy fit. And it almost came to Safe Church by default, because there was such a reluctance within the rest of the church to actually take on this issue. People were uncertain. I think you've all been following the debate following the Church of England's decision on the blessing of same-sex unions. And within ACSA, we've also got quite a diverse spectrum of spirituality. So there are people who are very strongly centered around the GAFCON response. And then there are people who are quite liberal and more towards the Episcopalian response. So it works well in that we are able to use the impact and influence and footprint of Safe Church. And because of where Safe Church sits in our canonical structure, the question of inclusion can't be left to a group of bishops or another commission to look at. And so Safe Church is, in fact, Act 20 in our canons, Safe and Inclusive Church. So that kind of gives it a little bit more clout. But we have been so busy with dealing with abuse that we've done very little, if any, work around inclusion. And we're hoping that 2023 we'll begin to do some further work around that. But it has its challenges. It's not easy. And I think if we could get it into the same place in our canons, because we're so hierarchical, I think inclusion will in time, hopefully, become a standalone issue. Because I keep learning about different forms or expressions of sexuality that are not particularly common to me or part of my ordinary parlance. I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Russell.
It does. Thank you. That's really interesting. And I certainly agree that it's really good, as you say, when things get into the canons, because otherwise, seems to me, things, reports and so on, they can be forgotten. Where something that's there in the canons, it's there permanently, at least until it's specifically amended or whatever in the future. So my second point I wanted to raise was, I'm absolutely amazed to hear about the work of these volunteers that you mention who follow up on complaints and issues that are raised through the commission? Because it seems to me a mammoth task for volunteers. I mean, just from what you've mentioned, we're talking about numerous civic jurisdictions, cross-country borders over the province, and dealing not just with clergy who've presumably made oaths of obedience or the equivalent, but also lay ministers, lay leaders who perhaps feel they're likely to feel they're a bit less answerable to church authority sometime. And certainly in England, Church of England, there isn't the same disciplinary mechanism. So you did mention there was some for lay leaders. That's really interesting. But so, but that's quite a huge task, it seems to me, for these volunteers to take on. I mean, clearly, obviously very committed, but I just wonder whether you could say a bit more about the sort of practicalities, how you recruit and train, and what sort of commitment people make to doing this.
Thanks, Russell. So we have exactly 450,000 per annum on the ACSA budget for Safe Church, which I'm sure if you divide by 12, we'll see is not a lot of money. So we have some admin support, and we have, I get paid for 1 day a week, and then I have a colleague who gets paid for 1 day a week. What we have done is we cast the net quite wide, and what we talk about mostly is that this is a ministry, much more than a commission. And that's why volunteers have worked so well in it, because they've responded to the call to ministry. And so that is why we've been able to do as much as we can. We did at one stage think that we'd have kind of synodical process of getting people elected and onto the commission. We have since killed that very swiftly, and it is now by appointment. So basically, I kind of have a free hand. So the requirement is, can you work with me? Then you're part of the Safe Church Commission. If you can't work with me, you can't. But we are looking at succession planning, and we are talking about what are the characteristics or competencies we're looking for. So obviously there's need for legal people, specifically because it's got such a disciplinary process. We have a need for social workers and psychologists. We then do work with people who have some experience in investigations. We also then need people who are skilled in counseling. And who are able to journey with people, because often when people have been hurt in the church, it's one thing to investigate, write a report, but the person is still hurt, damaged, broken, and there's still some work that needs to happen. So there is Michael Lapsley, I'm sure some of you may be familiar with him, who is actually starting work, who's been doing work for quite some time on the healing of memories. And we've actually reached out to him to talk to him about how do we actually get that included in the ministry. But it really is an act of love from many people who come and just give of their time to deal with it. We then do have a process of paying for them to get some supervision and a debrief, because some of the cases we deal with are quite awful. I hope that helps. Thanks, Russell.
Yes, it does indeed. Thank you. So I want to open things up for others to make points or ask questions. I see in the chat Jacqueline Humphreys has made a point. Do you want to make that point aloud?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Russell. Just sort of thinking that you're absolutely right to say how we keep these two areas completely separate structurally within the Church of England. But although they're, in terms of how we officially deal with things, separate, there is increasingly overlap, because the experiences that are being reported by people from the LGBT plus community of how they've been treated are increasingly being raised as safeguarding issues for the safeguarding team to deal with. And so I'm guessing it's kind of in the light of that, what from your experience in the South African context might be useful for the Church of England to know when trying to deal with this, and whether there's a kind of helpful way to see how the two might be better integrated and see how they impact on each other?
Thanks for that question, Jacqueline. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you all. We have what we call load shedding in South Africa, and my lights have just gone off. So I'm now speaking to you almost by candlelight. So Jacqueline, the reason we went for the inclusion so specifically is we were almost forced into it because of our legal system and the strong emphasis on human rights and dignity. And so what I agree with you that more often than not in the church, people who identify differently on the sexual spectrum have had the most appalling experiences. And if we continue to treat it as a standalone issue, I think we're going to lose the opportunity to actually get into a place of fullness, and in terms of who we are called to be in the church and in Christ. And so we are journeying for now with it together. As I said earlier, it's not easy. And I don't have any wisdom to offer you except to say, do it and see how it goes.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline, for the question, and Rosalie for the answer. Ashok, you've raised your hand. Do you want to make your point or ask your question?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question, and it's not been touched on in the talk. And that is, I was wondering how racially diverse and inclusive the Church of England is in South Africa. Is it the case, for instance, that in the wealthy parts of cities like Johannesburg, the congregations are largely or predominantly white, and in poor areas like Soweto, they're largely black? Or are congregations diverse? And the second question is whether you have the same issue as we have in England, which is that the size of congregations in Church of England churches is declining very rapidly, particularly among younger people who, by and large, know little or nothing about Christianity nowadays. Is that happening in South Africa?
Thanks for the question, Ashok. So first off, the Anglican churches in Southern Africa have in principle never been segregated. That has been our point of departure. However, the structural realities of apartheid have meant that certain parishes are predominantly one color rather than another. You may recall that we had the Group Areas Act, so people of certain colors could only live in certain places. And that was then the texture and color of the particular congregation. In about the late 80s, early 90s, some of the aspects of the Group Areas Act were changed or relaxed, and it is now a lot more along class lines that we find our congregations made up. So in the urban areas, we sort of have wealthy, diverse parishes but it's sprinklings in places, in other places it's predominantly Black, and in rural communities, it is predominantly Black, with an occasional sprinkling of other races. So our diversity is made up in that sense. We're going to run our census and we'll get a better sense of what we look like. Most interestingly is that in our rural areas and in the traditional townships, there are very strong young people in the parishes. And I think Lulama was here earlier, and she's still here. She's our provincial youth chairperson, and she could probably give you a better answer in terms of young people. But our parishes in traditionally Black areas continue to grow. It's parishes in the white areas that have have shown signs of decline. Thanks, Ashok. Lulama, do you want to add anything about the young people, please?
Please do, Lulama, if you'd like to speak.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Rosalie. Yes, my name is Lulama. I'm happy to be here. So just to add on what Canon Rosalie was saying in terms of young people, we've got young people diverse in different dioceses, but it is true that the there's a decline, a big decline in terms of young people being active in parishes. And obviously there's a lot of issues and a lot of social ills that young people are dealing with in different contexts within Southern Africa. And that contributes to the decline, to the decline in them being present in churches, them being present in ministry. But to touch also on the safe and inclusive issue within young people, I think, the church not being able to address some of the issues within inclusion. And when I say the church not being able to address, maybe as aggressive and rapid and quick as we would like it to happen, as young people, sometimes discourages the young people within the church, and some of them, leave the church because of some of these issues that sometimes are not resolved, sometimes are taking forever to be resolved, and also not feeling like, me identifying myself, as a certain sex, then I'm not welcomed in church. And because in certain contexts, also, these discussions are not being had. It's still very uncomfortable to have some of the discussions, even, rape, young people coming forward and saying that I've been raped. It's still a very, touchy subject. And because they are not, they don't have a safe space in the context of church, it's not a go-to area for most young people. And it's painful, to think that the young people, when they think of church, they don't think of safety, they don't think of home, they don't think of freedom, they think of the opposite. That is very painful. But this is the work of the Safe and Inclusive Church, and we are hoping and praying that as this ministry grows, young people are able to, be more exposed onto it, learn more, and also, come back to church.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I see we've got Nolene in the chat. Would you like to ask a question or make a point?
Good evening. Hello, Rosalie. I think I wanted to add on to what Lulama said. In the context where I am now for the last 3 years, the issue of young people and them feeling that they have a space in the life of the church has become quite a topic of very hot discussion. And also in the context where I am ministering at the moment, where the issue of inclusion becomes a big question of having quite a big community of the LGBTIQ plus, and trying to get them to come to church is one of the challenges, because we have been taught that church does not welcome the LGBTIQ plus community. They've got no space, they're not safe, and working in a community where the stories are so horrific. I want to encourage and applaud Rosalie and her team for the work they are doing. But I think the church now has to start speaking openly on how, I think, to show practically how the church needs to teach how we need to become inclusive. Because in the community I'm working in, which is the community I come from, there's quite a big community of LGBTIQ, and it's young ones. So for me at the moment is I'm trying to create the space for them in the church where they feel safe and not judged and not looked upon as if they are alien from another planet. So I just wanted to add on to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nolene, for that point. Do you want to come back, add any more, Rosalie or Lulama, in response to what Nolene has said? Well, thank you, Nolene, for making the point, which is much appreciated to add to what was being said. I don't at the moment see anyone with a hand up or comment in the chat, so hopefully people will have other things to add. But I've got one more question, Rosalie, if I may. Coming back to the fact you said the structure of the commission is on the provincial level, that that you and your colleague are the part-time paid staff, otherwise volunteers, and taken very much at the provincial level. And there's something of a debate in the Church of England about specifically safeguarding matters as to where the authority properly lies, and the practical ability to respond as well. Should it be at the national, we're two provinces, but the national level, provincial level, General Synod level, or at the diocesan level? Because, for example, our the recent General Synod was changing the structures so that we going to have diocesan safeguarding officers rather than advisors, but equally more structures at national level. So there's a bit of a tension there, but it seems to me what you were describing, the diocesan level has almost no input in the commission. Everything's done on the provincial level. Is that right? And was that and were there practical or theological reasons behind that? Just interested in if you have any insights there.
Thanks, Russell. It's an issue we've grappled with, and the ideal model we want is to actually have a safeguarding officer at parish level, so that issues actually get dealt with at the level that they happen. So what the structure I mentioned earlier about wanting a psychologist, a doctor, lawyer, can be replicated perhaps at parish or archdeaconry level, and then have a diocesan team, and then the provincial team. The ideal is that the provincial team would then provide policy guidance and oversight, and almost be a sort of review place. So because there's such a huge trust deficit in processes, because of the concealment that's taken place through the years, what we do is we make use of local diocesan teams that we've identified, and we then make sure that there's a provincial person who acts as oversight, so that nothing can be swept under the carpet, things cannot be hidden, but that we also then build capacity at local level. Because you're quite correct, it's impossible to, I've not been to the island of St. Helena, it's not on my bucket list. But so it's best that St. Helena actually has a team that's able to deal with it. So that's the ideal for us, and that's what we do at present. So we identify, given the nature of the complaint, we will then sort of get a response team together, depending on what the matter is. We'll identify people, as you rightly said earlier, on Zoom's made it possible for us to do some of this remotely. Obviously, you can't do sexual abuse remotely. That requires some in-person presence. So that does add to some of the costs and some of the challenges. But that is the ideal that we strive towards. But to make sure that things don't get swept under, we then let it always get reported to the provincial body, and we will then work with the local structure to get it investigated. What we have built in, because we are so firmly established at the provincial level, is that we've, of our own bat, decided that there's a mechanism for review. Because this is an act in the canons, you can't ignore the recommendations from Safe Church. There's in fact a charge that you'd face. And so we've actually got you can now appeal to the provincial chancellor for a review. He can't change our decision, but he can review it. That's all he can do. And so that's what we have in place, just to make sure that the absolute power that Safe Church currently has doesn't get abused, and that there is some checks and balances in place. I know that's one of the things the Church of England was struggling with as well, is about where does it end up. What we say, though, is that because when a matter goes wrong, people are not interested in suing the local structure. They want to sue the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. In fact, if a matter that's gone to court, we are always cited as one of the respondents. Because as we all say, our lawyers will tell you, We go where we think the money is. We're not going to bother with the small fish. And so that's what we've also used in terms of getting the level of compliance and acceptance for the ministry at the state it's in, because we say that if you get sued, it's ACSA who gets sued. But if you made the decision at local level and you did it wrong, it doesn't matter because we're still going to pay the price. So we have in our screening process, we have included a safe and inclusive form church declaration form. And that's almost your statement of conscience to say you haven't been. So before we used to say you weren't convicted, then we said you weren't accused. We now say that we used to say you weren't charged. We now say, have you been accused? Because given the state that our criminal justice system is at, there are lots of accusations, but the matter will never come to court. So you could have been accused or charged with being a pedophile, but you've not been convicted, and we could still make you the head of the Sunday school. So we've now actually said if you've been charged, if the person is not able to complete the declaration, that declaration is sent to Safe Church. The diocesan bishop doesn't have authority to actually say this person can come in, and then we will then put in place what we think are the necessary safeguarding measures in order to enable ministry. I hope that helps. Thank you.
No, it does very much. It's a very clear answer. I'm still in awe of the scale. When you a church of 5 million people and everything coming to you. So I'm sure all our good wishes and prayers are with the work that you you do, Rosalie. Such important work. I mean, we do just have a few more minutes. If there are any more points or questions, I don't see any hands up in the chat at the moment. If anyone has a burning issue, otherwise we can start to draw things to a close. I found this really fascinating myself, and clearly from all the conversation that's been generated from the other participants, others have as well. I did just want to say that because this evening we have touched just on these serious matters, and for all of us, sometimes when these things are talked about and mentioned, they can affect us unexpectedly and quite deeply. So I just want to say to everybody in the meeting, if you do find that this has caused thoughts or memories to come to the fore, do encourage people to make an opportunity to talk that over with a trusted friend, member of the clergy or professional to do that. If this was your first Ecclesiastical Law Society meeting, I do encourage everyone here to look on our website. We have some events in person, which are usually in England, but also events online. Do sign up for those. You're very welcome to any of them. If you're near London, we've got one in person next week. That's there on the website. It'd be very good to see you. As I said at the beginning, Rosalie, I think that a great strength of Zoom that so many of us discovered during the pandemic is the fact that we can meet, not just meetings we would have had in person, but these sort of meetings which are made possible. And this evening has really helped me to see the value in just hearing from another part of the Anglican Church, someone with your great expertise and experience, but addressing very similar issues to other churches, but each of us has our own context. And just to hear the background, the story, how things have developed in ACSA, I think really helps us see things a little bit differently, that it's possible to take different routes and things that we can learn from. So really appreciate the time you've taken to share your knowledge and expertise. Want to thank Norman Boakes, who's assisted with the running of the Zoom event, but most of all, Rosalie, the fact that you've been grappling with candlelight to talk to us from across the world. It's above and beyond the call. There we are, above and beyond the call of duty. So grateful. Thank you so much for your time, and God bless all your work.
Thanks very much, everyone. Stay safe and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.